Hey everybody, welcome back to Run and Gun, and this episode is going to be all about how to create and capture and edit amazing waterfall photos. So let's just jump right into it. Let's talk about my camera settings, and then we'll get into how to edit and process these images. So I'm in Adobe Lightroom right now, and if you look at the upper right hand corner up here, you can see my camera settings. So let's get into it. My ISO was at 100. I shot pretty wide at 24 millimeters. My f-stop and my aperture was closed down to f20, and my shutter was open for 2 seconds to get this exposure. Now for ISO, you're always going to want to use the lowest ISO possible. That's pretty much a general rule in photography for any photograph that you're capturing. Low ISOs mean less noise, especially in longer exposures. So ISO 100, that's going to be consistent through all of these images. That's the lowest I can shoot on my Canon 5D Mark II. So let's look at our f-stop at our aperture value right here. We're at f20. Most of these images are going to be f16, f18, f20, or f22. I really want to close down my aperture because remember, I'm going to have my shutter open for a longer amount of time, and I like that deep depth of field of a closed down aperture. Now you can also use neutral density filters for a shallower depth of field to let less light in, and then you can open up your aperture a little bit more. But if you don't have ND filters, really quick and easy way, just close down your aperture. Now let's talk about our exposure time, or our shutter speed. Now for this particular photo, it was at 2 seconds. Let's take a look at another one. The settings we have for this one, 1 second, f16. So just playing back and forth between your exposure times. I recommend roughly between, this one was 1.3 seconds, so a second and a half. Try roughly between a half second and 1 or 2 seconds, maybe 3 seconds. That should be just enough time to get this nice flow of water motion right here and the mist, and just get a nice surreal looking image without having to do, a 5, 10, 30 second long exposure, 5 minute long exposure. You don't really need that without using ND filters. So time of day is also extremely important. That's going to be one of my biggest tips. I shot all of these at sunset, where most of the sun was being blocked out by the trees up here, as you can see in the background. So my biggest tip would be shoot at sunrise or sunset. That just makes your longer exposures easier. It gives you better color quality. It's terrible trying to shoot a waterfall with the sun coming, straight down, exposing or overexposing all of this. It just makes longer exposures extremely difficult. So another tip I have before we talk about how I edit these images is keep your camera clear of water spots. You have mist, you have splashing water. We're talking about waterfalls here. So it's not that unrealistic to think that your lens might get covered in water, your gear might get covered in water. Make sure you're keeping your gear dry, and then checking the front of your lens. As you can see in this image right here, I had a little bit of buildup of some water droplets over here on this log. They're going to be especially easy to see, and they're going to stand out in the darker parts of your image. So every couple exposures, just keep checking the front of your lens, bring a lens cleaning cloth, and make sure you're keeping your lens and your gear dry. Alright, so as you can see, we're in Adobe Lightroom still. I like to do some of my light editing in Lightroom, no pun intended. But before I bring my image into Photoshop, I'll always like to do minor adjustments of my crop, my color balance, exposure, contrast, just the basic things right here before I do anything major in Photoshop. So let's take a look at the before and then the after. I just brought up my contrast a little bit, simple things. I brought down the highlights. They were a little overexposed. When I brought my exposure up, I brought the contrast up, so that meant I had to bring up my shadows just a little bit. Maybe a little bit of clarity. Don't overdo it with clarity. Less is always more. And then vibrance and saturation, just to bring out some of the hues and awesome cool colors of these waterfalls, which brings me to color temperature. You're always going to want to white balance properly, and then usually I come in here and I'll add just a little bit of a cooler tone, just because we're photographing water, and water looks better blue than it does yellow. So those are some of the minor adjustments I'll make in Adobe Lightroom. Now let's take some of these images in Photoshop and really get into the processing and see what we can make. Alright, so now we're in Photoshop. I just brought my photo in from Adobe Lightroom, where I do my minor edits. Now I do some of my more intense edits in Photoshop. So I'm going to scan around my image a little bit, just look around for anything I want to correct. I see some dust spots from some dust that was on my sensor, so I'm going to clone stamp, select, hold down Alt, select where I want to grab my sample from, and get rid of that dust spot. There's another one right there. I know I saw one up in the waterfall. Here's a big one right there. I don't like that. Be very careful. Waterfalls have a very distinct flow to them, and you don't want to mess that up or it'll look extremely edited and you'll really screw it up. So make sure you're conscious about the distinct flow and the direction of the waterfall in these long exposures. So after I remove any dust or any minor mistakes, I like to go in and do some dodging and burning. I like to burn my highlights just a little bit, highlights and midtones, just to get a little bit more contrast in here. So I'll find some of these not quite white areas of the waterfall just to bring out a little bit of that contrast. And you can change your exposure here and the range that you want it to affect, and the exposure will affect how strong you want your dodging and burning to be. So after I go in here and just add a little bit of contrast in here, now I will go into my, my highlights, turn down some of these areas a little bit. They're a little bit bright over here. That looks okay. Now I will go and do some dodging and brighten some areas up. Let's see what I can brighten up. I like to brighten up my shadows just a little bit. Over here it's a little dark, 14%, that's a little much. Try 10%. There we go, just a little bit, just a little bit. I leave my edges and my corners a little bit dark. It looks like a nice natural vignette. This streak right here is a little dark. I'll bring it up just a little bit. Now you can kind of see some of those rocks underneath water right there. That looks kind of cool. I like that. The dark's there, so that looks good. I will now duplicate this layer, start adding some more effects on it. So let's call this our working layer. And always have a nice working layer, and usually leave your background layer so you'll have something to go back to in case you ever mess anything up, so it's non-destructive editing. Alright, so I did my dodging and burning. Let's try the Orton effect. I talked to you guys a little bit about the Orton effect in one of my Nifty 50 videos. I'll duplicate this layer, Control J. I will go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Now the larger your image, the higher megapixel, you're really going to want to crank up this blur. Lower megapixel images and smaller resolution images, you can turn down the blur and make it a little bit less strong. So I'll go up here, 46, it's a little bit much, 26, yeah, you still want to see kind of what's going on. Turn up my contrast just a little bit, open up Control M for curves, really turn up my highlights, turn down my shadows just a little bit. I'm already loving that color, those deep blues that I'm seeing in there. That looks awesome. And then I will go in my opacity here, turn that down just a little bit. There we go. Now I'm getting that nice glow. That looks awesome. Now what I didn't talk about is some of the transfer modes that you can use. You can set your transfer mode to soft light. That just darkens up your shadows right here. This is why I do my dodging and burning if I want to use my Orton effect layer. And let's actually name that real quick. Our Orton effect layer, so we don't get these confused. To soft light, or if you want it stronger, try overlay. Overlay is kind of just like a stronger version of soft light. So there's our Orton effect, and we can play with it. Really go intense there. I usually like using soft light. It's just lighter. A slightly less saturated effect. So there's without the Orton effect, and here's with the Orton effect. I love that so far. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit more. That's just the amount of glow I want. And now I'll take my working layer, and I want to bring back some of the details in this rock here and some of the details in this water that we may have lost a little bit with this Orton effect layer. So I will Control J to duplicate, and I will call this let's see, sharpening, and I will go to Filter, Other, High Pass. Now what High Pass does, it creates this high pass which will bring out some of the contrast and some of the very minor details. So you can select the radius. The smaller the radius, the smaller the amount of detail it will affect, and the larger radius, you'll start getting these glowy HDR looking edges. You don't really want that. It's a little bit too much contrast and glow. You don't want your highlights glowing. So I'll go into a smaller radius here, click OK to affect my small details, and change this to soft light as well. And then we're going to go in here and you can really see how much this affected. I'll turn this off and look at mushy trees just kind of blending together back there. Mushy leaves, turn that on. Just sharpened up all of those leaves. I sharpened up these rocks over here. We'll turn that on and off just to bring out that sharpness underneath the glow, because you don't want to lose that. So that looks awesome so far. Let's see what else we can do. We did some mid-tone contrast. I usually like to end my images with a nice curves layer and go up to layer, new adjustment layer, and curves. I love curves. And then I will usually bring up my highlights just a little bit. I like that right there. Bring down my shadows just a little bit, and I think that looks great. There's a nice bright waterfall. This is the focal point of my image right here in the center, and then it kind of trails off to the darker edges of the photo. So I like this waterfall photo. You can always edit your curves the way you want them to. Maybe you don't want deep blacks in your image. Maybe you want it to fall off, be a little bit lighter here. Some people like those kind of mushy blacks or those lifted shadows. You can do the same thing. I can cut my highlights here in curves. Curves is such a powerful tool. I always talk about it. Maybe you like your image looking more like that. It's this kind of trendy Instagram look or old film look. I actually like that. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit. I kind of have an idea of how I want this to look. Yeah, I'll just clip my shadows just a little bit and bring them down. And then same thing with my highlights. Kind of has that film look to it. I like it. But every image is going to be a little bit different. You guys just have to see what you like. Maybe you don't like this curves layer. You can always get rid of it. You don't need it. Maybe you don't like the Orton effect. You can turn that off, turn that glow off. Or it's up to you guys. That's the cool thing about editing photos and photography and all these tools that I'm giving you. Use them how you like them. If you don't like them, don't use them. But here's my finished waterfall picture. I'm actually going to turn this curves down just a little bit more. Yeah, I like that. So here's my finished waterfall image. I hope you guys learned something about the shooting and the processing of these images, and I hope you guys subscribe if you want more of these videos. I do this for you guys, and all your support means a lot to me. So, like I said, your minor adjustments, they all depend on your images. So, that's it. I hope you guys learned something. Get out there and go shoot.